Okay, so welcome to my talk, and first of all, welcome to wherever you are around the world. I want to say benvenuto to my wonderful friends in Italy who are listening in. There's friends around the world in different countries that are watching, so I hope I've represented your languages here. And here is a little bit of a map of countries that are coming in to see us. We've got my wonderful friends and sisters, Jwala and Aparna in India, who are listening in with their students, and Elam from Iran, students from all over Europe and friends from all over Europe. I've got friends from Canada in Toronto, like Michael, Carmichael, and colleagues in the States like Meryl, Celianne, and others. And then friends in Brazil and Argentina, and a new one, Lingani in Botswana. So welcome to all of you. And if your nation is not represented in my map here, then do let me know so that I know for the next time. The first thing is that this talk is actually part of a 1-hour talk, and rather than truncate it so that you had, you've got things that you don't need to hear about, sorry, rather than missing out some juicy bits, I'm actually going to do the talk in 2 bits. So today's lecture talk will finish in about half an hour, and I'll give you a few teasers for the next one, which may be next Monday, but I'm not sure, but I will advertise it. If you're a tweeting type person, I would greatly appreciate you tweeting about this and hashtagging like this, because I'm trying to work out whether I've got a Twitter presence or not. That was just me practicing. Okay, so my thanks are over. I am going to tell you what this talk is about. So I'm going to start with this, and I hope you all appreciate this.
Now you listen here. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. Now go away!
As those of you who are old enough will know, that was a scene from Monty Python's Life of Brian. And what Brian's mother says is that he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. What I'm going to try to do in this talk is to show you that something called the brain is not a naughty boy. He's actually extremely intelligent, but not well understood. Now, to start off, what I want to do is tell you that, remind you that the brain is everywhere in society. There's been a constant debate about whether mobile phones are frying our brains or not. There's been an upsurge in these brain trainers that are marketed for apparently older people who might be losing some of their cognitive faculties. And the spoiler alert is that they don't work. So please get your parent or grandparent something else for Christmas, not a brain trainer. There isn't any real evidence that these things work. Culture is coming in on the act. So this is a still from the film with Julianne Moore called Still Alice, where she plays, I think it's a professor of English at Columbia University, who is understanding that she is suffering from Alzheimer's, and it's about the breakdown of her memory and her language. Moving into the sporting domain, there's growing understanding of the fact that, that a lot of contact sports are giving young people head injuries, which result in major problems downstream. So a number of years ago, the Players Union in America, they sued the National Football League because it became apparent that 1 in 3 ex-American football players was retiring with Alzheimer's type problems. And there's a film called Concussion with Will Smith in it, which is a true story of a Nigerian doctor who started noticing that when he was autopsying the brains of some 40-year-old men who happened to have been ex-footballers and who were acting extremely erratically, that their brains looked like the brains of 80-year-old people with Alzheimer's. Any small head injuries will result in small, what we call lesions, which are bits of brain damage. Now, if you're doing that, if that just happens once or twice, that's okay. But when you're playing American football, or if you're a boxer or a wrestler, that's basically a daily thing that's happening to you. And effectively, what we're seeing is that we're having these young people with thousands of small knocks to their heads from early on in their lives when the brain is still forming, and they're growing into adults with a lot of undiagnosed brain injuries. In the UK, we've seen recently this being addressed in schools, such that with rugby, we're no longer, they're changing the rules of rugby to change some types of tackling, I think, at school, so that young boys and girls are not hitting their heads as much. And certainly in Scotland, I heard that they've changed the rules such that young people will not be allowed to head the ball. And there's research from Scotland that's shown that even just heading a ball very briefly has an impact on the way that nerve cells are working. So we're seeing in society a growing understanding of the impact of just what are small head knocks, but in fact are resulting in a lot of brain injury. Now, some of you may have heard of the Ig Nobel Prize, which is a prize which is like the Nobel Prize, but it's a prize that is for something that initially makes you laugh, but then makes you think. And the Ig Nobel Prize a number of years ago was won by someone I know at University College in London called Eleanor Maguire. And she had this amazing finding, which is that a part of the brain known as the hippocampus, which is extremely important in our ability, in our memory, but also in our ability to navigate around the world, was very big in London taxi drivers. And what she noticed was that the more someone drove a taxi, the bigger their hippocampus became. And she was able to actually track trainee taxi drivers who were learning the routes of London, and actually see that over a period of about 2 years, which is how long it takes to learn the streets of London, the hippocampus actually grew in these people. And it was a wonderful finding, because it demonstrated not only that this area was important for our spatial navigation, but also that the brain is like a muscle, and that if you use it and exercise it, then certain areas, not all, but certain areas will grow. Now, the interesting thing is that this screenshot that I've given you is from 2017, because Eleanor won the Ig Nobel Prize quite a few years ago for that finding, at least 10, 15 years ago. But in 2017, her group of researchers in London have shown that the same part of the brain is beginning to turn off in people who've become so used to using sat-nav that they're not actually using that part of the brain. So we're seeing the reverse of using the brain. When you don't use it, and this area of the brain is very important for spatial navigation, if you're relying on sat-nav or Alexa or whoever to tell you what to do, then that part of the brain basically goes to sleep. So be careful. Now, as we know, unfortunately, the reason that we're together, but socially distant from one another, or physically distant from one another, is the coronavirus or COVID-19. And just recently, researchers at Johns Hopkins University in America are looking to see whether there are any impacts on the brain of this virus. And they have documented one person in whom they've noticed that there are some changes in the brain following this person having COVID-19. Now, this is only one case, so I don't want to be alarmist. There may be underlying conditions that this lady had, which are nothing to do with COVID. So they will need to keep replicating this and showing it with other people. And it may be that the virus doesn't have an impact on the brain. But we're saying that researchers are even looking at this. So I hope that that little review demonstrates that while neuropsychology, etc., is something that some people like myself work in, it's actually something that is extremely helpful. And we're seeing that society is really interested in this area. So now I'm going to tell you a few facts. The brain weighs about 2.5% of our total body weight. So it's 1/40th of the entire brain, or body, sorry. And yet it accounts for 20% of our energy consumption when we're at rest. So just sitting there, watching this, listening to me, 1/5 of all of the energy that your body has got is being taken up by the brain. Even though it's 1/40th of the brain, of the whole body, 1/5 of all your energy right now is going to the brain. And it burns oxygen and glucose, which are the fuels of the body, at 10 times the rate of other organs, such as the liver and the kidneys. So, to pardon a pun, it's punching above its weight there. It's a very small proportion of our entire weight, and yet it seems to be consuming energy a lot more than other parts of the body, which implies that it's working a lot. There are supposed to be 86 billion nerve cells in the brain. And here, what I've given you is a little diagram of a nerve cell, which is basically a blob like this, and then this long tail, which is its cable for communicating with other neurons. Now you see at the end, it's got these little arms, and over here it's got little arms as well. Each of those arms allows a neuron to connect with another neuron. Now, each of these little guys here can make up to 1,000 connections with other nerve cells. And there are 86 billion of these nerve cells. So it's been calculated that hypothetically, there are more possible interconnections within the human brain than there are atoms in the observable universe. That doesn't actually mean that there are many more interconnections. It simply means that there are potentially more interconnections within the brain than in the entire known atoms in the entire known universe. So that gives us a sense of the potential of the brain, and it shows that the brain is an extremely complex organism. So moving from facts to not facts, or neuromyths, or neurobollocks, as I call it, there's no such thing as a male and female brain. And this is one of those ridiculous things in society where there are suggestions that there are male and female brains. There aren't. There are differences, gross differences between male and female brains, but you can't look at a brain and say that's a male brain and that's a female brain. It's just ludicrous. There's no such thing as left-brained and right-brained people. There are differences between what the left part of the brain and the right part of the brain do, but that doesn't mean that a person is predominantly one or the other. Otherwise, that just makes no sense. All of us have got a left brain and a right brain, and the two halves do different things, but they have to work together. It's impossible to survive with just one, and you can't say that someone is left-brained or right-brained. For what we do in our daily lives, we need both of them. And one of the biggest myths, we do not only use 10% of the brain. This is one of those ludicrous things that I've heard over and over again, and it actually is nonsensical. Now, what I always say is that if we only use 10% of the brain, what that would mean is that I could take an ice cream scoop and scoop out 90% of your brain, and you should still be able to function. But I can tell you categorically that I've seen patients, or I've known of patients who've had a tiny, tiny area of brain damage, and their whole life has been completely destroyed because of a tiny area of brain damage. So it's not the case that we only use 10% of the brain. The way I prefer to say it is actually that we probably only understand about 7% of the brain. And being a bit of an arrogant species, we think that we're almost there. And since we only understand 7%, we give it another 3% and think that that's how much we use. That's not the case at all. As you'll see in part 2 of this lecture next week, we're only at the beginnings of our understanding of the brain. And so that moves me into a historical overview. How have we come to what we know today? So I'm going to move through history and first of all, look at our ancient ancestors and see what they thought about the brain. I'll start in ancient Egypt, and then I'll move to ancient India, and then to the ancient Greeks. So this is a hieroglyphic, and it's from something known as the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus. It's in a papyrus that was found, I think, in somewhere in Cairo, probably by someone called Edwin Smith, presumably. And it is the oldest written documentation of the word brain. It's the first written account of the physical anatomy of the brain and the fluids of the brain. And this is because of the belief system of the ancient Egyptians, because their pharaohs were going to have another life after they died in this one, they needed to keep their organs. So when they were mummified, they had to take all of their organs out of the body, and they put them in these little jars called canopic jars. And so they had to extract the organs. Now, to make it so that they didn't have to cut open the skull of their pharaoh, they managed to somehow pull the brain through the nose of the pharaoh. I don't know how they did it, but apparently they did. And because of that, they were able to understand something about the anatomy of the brain and the fluids. The Edwin Smith papyrus was written about 1700 BC, but it's said to go based on text that could go back to about 3000 BC. So 5,000 years ago, a little Egyptian man was sat there, a scribe, who created this pictogram, which represents the brain. So about 5,000 years ago, there was some understanding of this thing inside our skull. Now moving to ancient India, which is what my heritage is. In the ancient Indian texts, Javaka is spoken about, and he was a physician who's known to have treated the Lord Buddha. And he's said to have operated on the brain of a merchant. Now, ancient India had a lot of knowledge of science, mathematics, the body, etc. And those of you who've ever heard of a nose job, rhinoplasty, that was actually invented in ancient India. So the suggestion that someone may have operated on the brain of a merchant in ancient India isn't that far-fetched. And in the Hindu holy books, the Vedas, which were composed about 1000 BC, there is mention of 9 areas of the brain which map to different points along our spinal cord, which are known as chakras. Now, those chakras are still used in complementary medicine today. So in ancient India, up 3,000 years ago, there was some sort of understanding of the brain if a physician operated on the brain of a merchant, or if there's this understanding of these areas that map to the spinal cord. Now moving to ancient Greece, and I know that there's a whole group of people from Greece listening in right now, so I'm sure you'll be pleased with this. Hippocrates, who's the father of modern medicine, and when doctors do their medical training, when they qualify, they take the Hippocratic Oath named after Hippocrates. He wrote that men ought to know that from the human brain and from the brain only arise our pleasures, joys, laughter, and jests, as well as our sorrows, pains, griefs, and tears. It is the same thing which makes us mad or delirious, inspires us with dread and fear, brings us sleeplessness, inopportune mistakes, aimless anxieties, absent-mindedness, and acts that are contrary to habit. Now, a lot of what Hippocrates is talking about there are things that we know to be part of the human condition: emotions, fear, making mistakes, being anxious about things, etc. The important thing is that before Hippocrates, the feeling or the idea was that everything, especially the soul, emanated from the human heart. But Hippocrates was the person who basically took the center of our being from our heart up to our head. So this is 2,500 years ago or so. Now, guess what? Not much happened for about 2,850 years until this man came along. This man is Paul Broca, or was Paul Broca. He was a neurologist, so that's a medically trained doctor who worked with people who had disorders of the nervous system. And Broca had a patient who was known to have epilepsy and had suffered from epilepsy most of his life. And Broca noticed something rather interesting, that his patient wasn't able to speak. So if you asked the patient his name, the patient wasn't able to say anything. But if you asked the patient to, asked him to hold up 5 fingers, he was able to hold up 5 fingers, which showed that he could understand language and act on it by showing that he understood that you asked him to hold up 5 fingers. If you asked him to say how much is 2 plus 2, he would hold up 4 fingers. So that showed that he could understand the language and he could calculate and give the answer in terms of holding up 4 fingers. If you asked the patient to point to a chair, he could point to a chair, which showed that he could visually recognize the chair and point to it. If you asked him, how many fingers did I ask you to point to, hold up before? He would hold up 5 fingers, which showed that his memory worked. So Broca said that it was rather interesting that the patient couldn't speak, so he couldn't tell you his name, but he could do everything else. He could demonstrate his understanding of language. He could demonstrate his ability to add 2 and 2, so his numerical abilities. He could demonstrate his visual recognition by pointing to the chair, and he could demonstrate that his memory was okay because by holding up the 5 fingers that he'd done before. So Broca made what at the time was quite a revolutionary suggestion. He said, I think that the brain is specialized such that there's a part for speaking, there's another part for understanding, there's another part for counting, another part for seeing things, and another part for remembering things. And that only the part of the brain that is important for speaking has been damaged in my patient. Now, this is before MRI scans, but the patient eventually passed away. And this is the brain of that patient who became known as patient Tan. And it's been preserved in a medical museum in Paris. And just so you know, this is as if you're looking at the side of the person, and his eyes would be over here. So the front of his head is here, and this the back of his head here, and this would be around where his ears are. This area of blackness here, this is brain damage. And this is what they found when they autopsied Tan's brain when he passed away. That basically all of Tan's brain, all of this is completely normal. And they know that because of neuroanatomy and what the brain is supposed to look like. We all have slight differences in our brain, but generally speaking, these structures are all present in all of us. But we wouldn't have this area of blackness here. This area of blackness used to have brain cells like these, but because of the epilepsy that he was suffering, this area got killed, and therefore it filled up with fluid, and that is the area of brain damage. So one of Broca's hypotheses came out true, or his predictions, that only one area of brain is damaged in the patient and the rest of it is okay. Now in science, we never just assume everything is okay from seeing one finding. So just like the patient at Johns Hopkins University Hospital who might have some sort of brain problems because of COVID virus, they're not going to say that COVID causes brain disorders, because that's only one person. And as I said, it could have happened for other reasons as well. So we always replicate, we always look for other cases that are similar. So we didn't base all of our understanding on that one patient. He just happened to be a revolutionary first patient. Now, what happened is that Broca himself found that with a number of other patients of his, when they couldn't speak, if when they passed away, he looked at their brains, it was always this area of the brain that was damaged in them. And other neurologists around Europe who were communicating with one another found the same thing, that if they had a patient who couldn't speak but could do everything else, when they looked at the patient's brain at death, they always found that this area was damaged. So although we can't prove that language is in that area of the brain, we've got incredibly compelling evidence that that part of the brain, which is basically above your left temple, is where you create language. And in memory of Broca, that area is actually now known as Broca's area. And if a person has a stroke, which results in them not being able to speak, that is known as Broca's aphasia. So this finding and this suggestion from Broca was absolutely monumental in our understanding of how the brain processes information. Okay, so that set us going on a particular route, but in fact, not much happened for another 100 years or so, and that's a whole other lecture, so I'm not going to go into that now. What I want to talk to you about is why we explore the human brain. We explore the human brain to understand the steady state. So we want to understand how it is that you can be listening to my voice and understand what I'm saying and somehow make sense of that. You can take these squiggles of lines here and understand what they mean. We can look at the effect of drugs, etc. on you. We can understand the effects of the environment. So we know what happens when children live in very loving environments and what happens to them when they don't live in loving environments. And there are some impacts on the brain. The thing that I've dedicated the last 30 or so years of my life is to the study of the impact of brain damage, which is what I'm going to be talking about primarily today for the rest of this talk and then next week. And then a new field, about 20 years old, is attempting to help those with brain damage. And again, I'm going to talk about that next week. And then finally, an exciting new thing is how to find ways of improving brain function in healthy adults. So I'm going to start that in a moment. First of all, I just want to give you a sense of how much brain injury there is. So this is from the World Health Organization, and it's a map of the incidence of annual traumatic brain injury. So traumatic brain injury is not something that's from a virus or something like that, but due to car crashes, etc., assaults, etc. And the heat map is such that yellow colors down here mean about 800 per every 100,000 people. So that means that in Africa down here, we've got less traumatic brain injury. The darker the green color, the more the brain injury, the traumatic brain injury, up to the point where there's 1,300, excuse this banner coming up, there's 1,300 per every 100,000. So when it's dark green, as we see here in North America, that means that about 1% of the population is going to be experiencing some sort of traumatic brain injury, which is a fair amount. 1 in every 100 people is going to suffer some sort of traumatic brain injury. Now looking at brain injuries caused by road traffic accidents. And what we see is a reversing of the picture. we see that here in North America, we've got a lot of the general traumatic brain injury. And in these countries, there's less of the traumatic brain injury. But when we look at brain injuries caused by road traffic accidents, what we see is that there's a lot more. The redder colors mean that there's about 530 brain injuries because of road traffic accidents in the Southern Hemisphere. And we see India appalling, so many head injuries due to car crashes, etc. China, South America, etc. So that is how we try to understand the causes of brain injury. These are through road traffic accidents. Unfortunately, there are many other ways. I spoke about sporting injuries. That's one form. But then another form is domestic abuse. A lot of domestic abuse does not go reported. So if it's usually a woman who's being abused by her husband, usually does not go to a hospital and explain that she's been hit, etc., etc. So although the numbers suggest that in, say, North America, it might be 1% of people, the actual numbers of people who are experiencing brain injury is much more than 1%. So that's just to give you a context for the fact that what I'm going to show you is very extreme forms of brain injury, but brain injury is happening all around us all the time. So I'm going to tell you about a quote that I always use in my teaching about why we study people with brain damage. This quote is that in any well-made machine, one is ignorant of the working of most of the parts. The better they work, the less we are conscious of them. It is only a fault which draws attention to the existence of a mechanism at all. And I'll step you through what this means. What this means is that we have lots of systems and machines around us that are very, very complex, and they seem to be working fine, or rather, we don't understand their complexity because they're working fine. So those of you who drive a car, you don't need to be a car expert or an engineer or a mechanic to be able to drive the car. But if the car stops, running, then you could take the car to a mechanic and and get it fixed. And you could ask the mechanic, "What's wrong with my car?" And the mechanic might say, "Well, the gearbox isn't working." And you'd say, "What's a gearbox?" Because you don't know anything about cars. And they explain to you what a gearbox is. A couple of months later, your car stops working again, and you take it to the mechanic and you say, "Was it the gearbox?" And they say, "No, it's the fan belt." And you say, "What's a fan belt then?" And they explain to you the fan belt. A couple of months later, again, there's a problem. And this time it's something called the cooling system. Now, if you were unlucky enough, your car could keep breaking down over and over and over again, and you would eventually understand how the whole of the car works, not by studying the car while it's functioning, but actually by studying the car when it's broken up. And that looking at damaged systems allows us to see how complex things are underneath it. And that's what we're doing in trying to understand how we function by looking at someone with brain damage. So I'm going to demonstrate that to you by showing you a couple of patients that I've worked with. Now, a basic necessity for nourishment, so finding food, is avoiding danger and also becoming another animal's food, because you want to make sure that you eat the correct things, you don't eat the poisonous things, and the lion doesn't eat you. Now, we use that for, we need visual recognition for doing that. Now, we know that there's a special system for this because of a disorder that we've documented called visual agnosia. And some of you may have heard of this book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, by Oliver Sacks. And this is an example of visual agnosia. Now I'm going to introduce you to Philip, who is a patient that was studied by my PhD supervisor in Cambridge a number of years ago. And he was the victim of a road traffic accident. And Philip got damage to his brain in this part of the brain at the back, on both sides, I think it was. Now, what I'm going to do is to show you a small video, and I hope you can hear the sound.
One of the first things we learn to do is to recognise and name animals.
Camel. Camel? They're camels. I'll hazard a guess they're camels. Too late, giraffe. But if I hadn't seen the signpost, then I wouldn't have known.
Philip is not able to recognise what we see as a giraffe, which is very clear to us. We've always known it's a giraffe, except we haven't. We learned when we were 3 years old or something like that, that thing is called a giraffe. Philip looks at it and he doesn't know what it is. And eventually he says, is that a camel? And it's only when he sees the writing on the giraffe house that it's a giraffe that he realizes that it's a giraffe. Now, Philip has had this accident about 40 something years ago, and he's still got this condition. So he has major problems recognizing things visually, and especially living things, so animals, items of food, etc. And by studying people like Philip, just like by studying the car with the gearbox not working, etc., we're able to work out one part of the intact system. So we know that there's a part of our brain that is really important for visual recognition, particularly for recognizing visual objects. Okay, so now moving into another realm, as we evolved as humans, we eventually formed, as we evolved, we became social creatures. And so we started creating social structures in which, for survival, we needed to be able to recognize other members of our tribe. Now, we can recognize each other in many different ways, but it's not, what we find is that the face is the biggest way of recognizing someone else. You can recognize people by their voice, even their hair, even the way they walk, but the way that we recognize from the face is extremely important. Now, we know again that this system of recognition from the face is there because of this really rare disorder called prosopagnosia, which is sometimes called face blindness, but it's a very selective disorder in recognizing faces. My patient David unfortunately suffered from a massive brain hemorrhage that nearly killed him. And what we see here in this brain scan, which is as if we sliced his head like this, is that there's this area back here in the right of his brain, near the back, which is majorly damaged. Now, because the sound isn't working, I'm not going to be able to play you those videos, but I'll fix it for the next one so you can see both Philip and David. But I was doing work with him about 15 years ago when Tony Blair was our Prime Minister. And in the video, I'm showing him Tony Blair, and he says he doesn't know who this person is.
No.
Okay.
Is that Marilyn Monroe?
1 to 10?
I would say 7.
Okay.
Because of the little beauty spot and the red lips. Don't show red, but you can sort of,
Yeah, right.
I can imagine saying, "Happy birthday, Mr. President."
Okay. Now, in a talk that I was giving, a public talk like this one, but actually in person, it was during one of the Iraq wars, and David was there with my student Scott, who I think is out there listening to this talk. Hello, Scott. And David was sat with Scott, and after I explained that David didn't recognize our Prime Minister, I showed this face, and I couldn't even bring myself to say his name. I said, David couldn't even recognize this person, with the real kind of irritation in my voice. And David nudged Scott and said, "Scott, I didn't even recognize myself." And David said, Scott said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I was just showing a picture of me and I didn't realize that was me." And Scott said, that's not you, that's George Bush. And what you see there is that David can't recognize our then Prime Minister. He couldn't recognize his wife, his children, his grandchildren from their faces. And he sees a picture of a man who's similar age to him in black and white. And David actually has a rectangular face, just like George Bush's as well. So he heard me say, oh, David couldn't even recognize this person. And he put 2 and 2 together and got a bit of a banana there. And it demonstrates that these people can't even recognize their own faces. Now, in a test that we were doing, we wanted to look at certain types of brain processes, which I won't go into because of technical details which aren't necessary here. But in that type of test, we typically would show someone, say, 40 photographs, 20 of which are of just Joe Blogs, people that you would never have met before. And if I asked you, have you ever seen this person, you'd be expected to say no. But the other half of the photos would be of famous people, so celebrities, politicians, etc., but also members of the family, etc., and medical staff that have been working with the patient to see whether the patient recognizes any people who should be familiar to them. So we recreated this study for David, getting some pictures of his family, etc., and famous people. And we didn't know whether he recognized me or not. And so when Scott was testing David, he used this picture of me, which is quite an ancient picture from about 15 years ago, from the staff notice board at my previous university. And we made sure that I wasn't there on the day that David was being tested, in case me being around might give him a clue. And when David came to this face and he was asked, have you ever seen this face before? He said, yes. And Scott said, who is it? And he said, it's George Michael. Scott managed not to laugh his head off. He was very professional. And he said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you that that's George Michael? And he said 10. Now, for those of you who don't know who George Michael is, he was the singer in Wham, and then he went solo. And these are pictures of George Michael later on. Now, what's happening here? Now, what we see is that David probably noticed that I used to wear a gold earring, much like George Michael, that I had a goatee beard, much like George Michael, and I've got a dark skin. I'm Indian, George Michael was Greek. And he puts these visual clues together, the earring, the skin tone, and the goatee beard, and he somehow puts this together to work out what he thinks he's seeing. And it demonstrates 2 things. The first thing is that he's not blind. He can see my face. The second thing is that he's creating a visual jigsaw, which is definitely not what you do when you see me or you see someone you know. And by studying someone like David, we realized that there's a form of visual processing, which is this broken jigsaw processing. And there's another one called holistic processing, or configural, or gestalt. The technical term isn't important. The main thing is that we know from studying patients like David that there is a special type of visual processing in which you look at the face as a whole. You don't look at the left eye, the right eye, the nose, the mouth, and then say, who do I think that is? We think that from evolution, because the face is so incredibly important for our survival, the brain has developed this special mechanism for seeing the whole, and that is why we recognize people so easily, and which, if damaged in people like David, results in this really rare and difficult disorder. Now, as I said, it's a very rare disorder, acquired prosopagnosia. And what that means, prosopagnosia means difficulty in recognizing faces, and acquired means that it happened following brain damage. Now, I don't know what the statistics are, but it's 1 in tens of thousands that will get this particular disorder. But there is another form, which is called developmental prosopagnosia. And this is where people have had the problem from childhood without any known brain damage. So we have people around us who can't recognize each other, and people on TV, etc. But they've got no brain damage that we can see, like in the case of David. So these people have got a developmental form of prosopagnosia, kind of like developmental dyslexia, etc., that it's something that's always been there. And there are estimates that about 2.5% of people have got it. And in fact, there is a Facebook page for people with prosopagnosia. It's a public group that anyone who thinks that they've got face recognition disorders can join. And I know that there are people from the prosopagnosia group who've tuned in to listen to this talk. So if you know of anyone who has face recognition problems, do let them know about this. So about 1 in 40 children have got some sort of face recognition disorder. Unfortunately, most of them never tell someone, because part of it is that they find ways of recognizing people from their voices, their clothes, etc. But part of it is out of embarrassment. And we know that some of these kids end up with real kind of emotional problems because they exclude themselves from social activities, etc., etc. And so it can have real real impact on their lives. So my PhD student Claudia is going to be looking at how people with developmental prosopagnosia coped with the aim of trying to help kids with developmental prosopagnosia. So if you're a school teacher and you want to know more about our work, do let us know. Now, moving on from prosopagnosia, there is another end of the spectrum known as super recognition. And this is where there are people who are remarkable at face recognition many years after meeting someone very, very briefly. And so these people seem the exact opposite of the people with prosopagnosia. One of my colleagues, collaborators and friends, Josh Davis, I think is listening there. He is one of the world experts in this area, and he and I have done some very interesting work looking at police forces and how we can harness this particular skill that we see with these super recognizers. So I'm going to wrap up just because of time. The first half of this lecture has been to introduce you to the history of some things to do with brain research. And I've introduced you to some patients in the latter part of this lecture to show you that by studying people with these very rare and awful conditions, we can start getting an insight into how our brains work. So it's like that broken car. By looking at the broken car with the gearbox not working, we're getting clues onto how the internal mechanics and functioning of the intact brain works. Next time, I'll be looking at memory. So does your mother or grandmother have a bad short-term memory because she can't remember what you told her last week? In fact, it's not. What people think is short-term memory is not short-term memory at all. So I'm going to be talking about what is short-term memory and showing you videos of me working with the patient with extremely severe amnesia. Then using that same patient, I'm going to show you the remarkable finding that we have with patients like that, which is that although they can't remember something from literally 1 minute to the next, you can actually teach them new things, which seems counterintuitive that if someone can't remember things, how is it that they're able to learn something new? Then I'm going to go into a really exciting new avenue, which is how we can use a lot of the findings that we've got from studying the healthy brain and the unhealthy brain to improve the healthy brain. So this is about the neuroscience of mindfulness meditation. There's lots of really lovely work that's showing that a number of forms of mindfulness, different forms of meditation, etc., can actually improve brain health and improve mental health as a result of that. Then finally, I will tell you about the life of Brian, who I started this whole lecture with. So I'm sorry for the technical difficulties that we experienced. It was the first time. I will do my best to make sure that We don't have the sound problems as last time, and we don't have people trying to scribble across my screen like this. Listen out for information about the next lecture. I've got people's email addresses. I know that there's been a limit of 100 people allowed in this room, but I have streamed this on Facebook, so I hope people have been able to see that. I will be putting this onto YouTube as well, so hopefully people can catch up. So now I want to thank you for listening in. If you want to participate in my research, please get in touch with me at this email address. We've got lots of research going on with face recognition, with human memory, and also with how the front of the brain manages behavior. I do already have a couple of questions while I'm waiting for the questions to come in. I think John McDermott asked me whether, so this is John from London, he asked whether if a brain is damaged, whether there is any regrowth. The answer is yes. There is what we call neuroplasticity. So the brain can repair itself to some degree. Now this is a new area. We know that the brain can regenerate a bit, but we don't know how much, etc. So it's one of those things that in the future, we're going to be able to harness it. But at the moment, all we know is that there is some brain regrowth, but we don't know to what extent it's there. So yes, but watch this space. Okay. The next question was from Kerry, also from London, and that was whether whether if you have injuries to the front of the head, that can cause personality problems. The answer is, unfortunately, yes. Now, that doesn't mean any knocks to the front of the head, but we do know that the front of the brain, which is about a third of the brain, and compared to other animals, the front of our brain is much bigger. And in terms of evolution, it's the newest part of the brain. We know that that's where effectively our personality is. It's too simplistic to say that our personality is there, but it's generally there. Now, we know this from a remarkable case that happened about 150 years ago or 160 years ago in Vermont in North America, where a company that was laying down railroads, they needed to have timed explosions to lay down the tracks. And so all these tracks were being laid and timed explosions were going off. And unfortunately, there was an explosion that went off when it shouldn't have, and an iron bar about an inch thick flew up and it went through the lower left cheek of the individual, an individual called Phineas Gage, who was a supervisor in that company. Now, if you can imagine an iron bar, which is about an inch thick, going through your face, not a needle, an iron bar that thick. So an explosion happened and this thick iron rod flew up and went through this man's face, and it was traveling so fast that it flew a further 20 feet in the air before it landed. Now, unsurprisingly, Phineas Gage fell over. But surprisingly, he didn't die, even though an iron bar had shot through his face. Now, he was patched up medically, and eventually he was able to leave hospital. And the remarkable thing was that if Broca had tested Phineas Gage, he'd have found that his language worked, his understanding of language worked, his ability to speak, his memory, his counting, his vision, his face recognition, everything worked. And that's quite remarkable because it implied that there was nothing wrong with this man who'd had an iron bar go through his face and presumably part of his brain. But unfortunately, very quickly, it became apparent that although he could do these, what we call the primary abilities of remembering, speaking, understanding, etc., things had changed. This man became rather different. He was no longer able to organize himself. He made incredibly bad financial decisions. He became bankrupt, lost his job. He became socially really uncouth, so that he would urinate in public and swear, etc. So there's this remarkable change in personality. There was a neurologist who was working with him, kind of like a broker, called Harlow. And Harlow noticed this huge change, and he was the first person to suggest that maybe the front of the brain is really important in who we are. And he said that gauge is no longer gauge. So it seems that major damage to the front of the head can have a major impact on your personality. But given the size of the front of the head, it's not the case that the personality is everywhere. It is a complex issue, but major damage to the front of the brain can be problematic. Okay, so thank you for your question, Kerry. Now I'm going to move on to some questions from that have been sent in. So this is from Chris Whitehouse and Diane Jennings, which is that, is developmental prosopagnosia really rare? Now, it depends on how you define rare. I would say that it's not that rare, because 1 in 40 people have face recognition disorders. So it depends on how you define rare. The type of disorder that my patient David has, where he's got the acquired form, that's extremely rare. Whereas developmental is less rare than that. So it really depends on how you define rare. But if you went into an average room of 50 people, then one of those people probably has difficulties with recognizing faces. Okay, another question is from Lorenzo Dalba. Oh, hello, Lorenzo, up in The Hague. Is there any evidence that the brain reads, scans collective anxiety from others, and therefore triggers more anxiety and tension? I have no idea about that one, I'm afraid. What I would say is that that seems to be related to whether we're able to read emotions in other people. Because if you're able to read emotions in other people, you would be able to notice that other people are anxious, and therefore that would be something that you'd pick up. Now that can be, in terms of survival, a really positive thing, because you can, in terms of navigating through complex lives, etc., if you know who's tense and anxious, etc., it's really quite useful to be able to tell that. In terms of whether that causes tension within yourself, I don't know. Certainly there are people who notice emotions better than others. In terms of whether that results in their own tension, that's a separate thing. Okay, so let's see, from Linsell Hall, I think it is, says, you said there's no such thing as left and right brain, but does handedness tell us anything about an individual's brain functioning? For example, left-handedness has been linked to mental health and addiction. The answer is ish. I don't want to say any sweeping statements about left-handed people having mental health problems, etc., because they don't. Generally speaking, if we go back to our friend Broca and the patient Tan, and I showed you that the damage in that patient when he died was in the left part of the brain above the right temple. And that's where language is for most of us righties. But for people who are left-handed, things are a bit different. Some of those people still have language in the left hemisphere, but some of them have it in the right hemisphere. Some of them have it split between the two hemispheres. So it's quite a gray area. We do know from some research, and I did some research like this in the States, that suggests that the left hemisphere is more related to behavior that is positive. And in evolutionary terms, this is known as approach-related behavior. So something that's going to make you walk towards someone. Whereas the right hemisphere is more to do with withdrawal behavior, so negative behavior. So it might be because of fear or anger, etc. And we showed this with the way emotions are processed in the two hemispheres. And there does seem to be some suggestion that the left hemisphere processes positive emotions and the right hemisphere processes negative emotions. So there is a link at some level between a greater propensity, a greater likelihood of depression in left-handed people, but it's a complex thing. I don't think it's a one-for-one kind of thing. Okay, so the next question is from Natasha, which is, how did Broca treat his patient's stroke? Nowadays, patients receive specific drugs to stop the bleeding. To be honest, I don't know. This was in the 1860s. So I imagine that whatever treatment they had will have been extremely rudimentary. And as far as I know, patient Tan didn't survive for very long after Broca was treating him, but I don't know for that for certain. But certainly 160, 70 years ago, they didn't have anything like the knowledge we have of how to stop strokes. So I'm afraid I don't know. So we've still got a couple more questions coming in. So from Rick, who's Chinese, but who I think lives in Brighton. I'm wondering if the facial recognition skill could be strengthened through training. Oh, this is one of my favorite questions. The answer is no, or rather it is, but only a bit. So I was telling you about these people who are incredibly good at recognizing faces, these super recognizers. And some of you will have heard of the bell-shaped curve. And the bell-shaped curve is this finding in nature that that whenever you look at anything in nature, you tend to see that there are lots that are average and some that are above average and some that are below average. So if you went out and measured the trees on your street, if you live on a street with trees, so trees of the same species, what you'll find is that a lot of them are of a particular height. Some of them are lower in height, some of them are taller in height. We see that in our heights, in our running speeds, in our IQs, etc. So nature has something about creating the average, which is the middle fat bit of the bell shape, and then the bits that tail off to the side, which are known as the tails. Now, with these super recognizers and people with prosopagnosia, what we have is that the people with prosopagnosia might be at the very low end of this bell curve of face recognition abilities. They're at the very low end, just like someone who might be very slow at running. Then at the very high end, we've got these super recognizers. So they seem to be possibly mirror images of one another. So one of the questions that I would often get is it possible to train people? So Joe Average, who's in the middle of your bell curve, is it possible to train that person to become a super recognizer? And the answer would be no. It's possible to make you better at face recognition by giving you some training in how to recognize faces a bit better than you currently do, but I can't make anyone a super recognizer. So the analogy I would give is that if you're a runner, with some training or some coaching, any person can be improved. So I can, not me, but a running coach would improve any person's running abilities and would move them, if you can visually and see what I'm referring to, towards the right-hand edge of the bell curve, so make you better. But no running coach is going to turn you into Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt already had the genetics for being able to run really fast, and he was trained to be incredibly fast. So in the same way with these super recognizers, we have people who are really good at, already have a good skill, and they've just practiced it well. And that's one of the things that we think is happening, that as with a lot of things that happen in human psychology, it's a combination of nature, which is your genetics, and nurture, which is your environment and the things that you do or things that happen to you. So if you've got the natural ability, like Usain Bolt will have had, you can become extremely good at that. If you're an okay runner, you can become a better runner. If you've got good face recognition, you can become better at it, but you can't turn someone who's completely average into a super recognizer. And that's the case for virtually any aspect of human behavior. Okay, I'm looking at other questions from Quentin and I think Basildon. Is it possible to lose or acquire new neurons? Well, we're all losing neurons right now. Cell death and neuronal death is constantly happening. The brain is really clever, and it is constantly doing homework. It is pruning away, and this is happening especially at night. Sleep is not actually for rest. Sleep is a form of housekeeping within the brain that allows the brain to work out which bits are useful and which bits aren't useful. And those connections that I spoke about right at the beginning, what the brain is doing is it's keeping some of those connections, and it's saying, I don't think these other connections are useful. So neuronal death is happening all of the time. There's neuronal growth, which is known as neurogenesis. So there is new growth of brain cells. And we know this because of things like the mindfulness meditation work that I'm going to tell you about next week. And from that work that Eleanor Maguire did with the London taxi drivers and the hippocampus as the taxi drivers were learning the routes of London. So we know that new neurons are being created. They're also dying. The big trick is to have more neuronal growth than neuronal death. And that is one of the big things that we're trying to look for. Then we've got a question from Thomas in Athens, which is that, what would you tell us about the use of virtual reality and technology in general in cognitive rehabilitation? I won't talk too much about that because that's quite a specific question, but cognitive rehabilitation, for those who don't know, is the attempt to improve abilities like speaking or understanding or memory or even face recognition, or our ability to make decisions, etc. And so cognitive rehabilitation is the attempt to make those things better. And what we find is that virtual reality, which is kind of like computer games, that's the easiest way to think about it, virtual reality can be really useful for helping us in this rehabilitation. And Thomas has probably asked that because he knows that that some of my research is actually linked to it. And that is something that I can talk to some people about if they'd like. So those are all the questions that I've received so far. I'm not getting any more. So if, unless I get some questions in the next minute or so, I'm gonna call it a day because I haven't had dinner yet and I'm looking for dinner or I need dinner. So I will wait another minute or so. And if I don't get any questions, I will call this a day. It's been 1 hour and 20 minutes already. So I think you're probably sick of the sound of my voice anyway. Right, I'm going to call it a day. Thank you very much for those of you who have persevered with the technological challenges. I hope you found this interesting. Do tell your friends. Next time, I'm going to have to set it up so that more than 100 people can watch this, or people know what to do on Facebook, or I can do it on YouTube. But I'm not very technologically minded, but Lofty, my savior, is going to help me with all of this. So do spread the word. With Zoom, the this, everything that I've been saying, I think is being recorded and videoed rather. So I'm going to make that video available so that other people can see it. So hopefully next time we'll have a more techno-friendly session. I urge you or encourage you to come along, because the videos of Nicola, my patient with amnesia, are quite heartrending, and they really teach us something quite crucial about memory and amnesia, but also about the hope that we can get by studying people like Nicola, by finding out what it is that people like Nicola can still do. Because brain damage doesn't strip someone of every faculty. They do have intact abilities, and that is a really exciting area to try to find the things that a patient can still do, because we can use those and harness those to try to improve the lives of these patients. And that's something that I'll be talking about next week, and of course about mindfulness, and then the wrap up, which is on the life of Brian. Please do share information about this, my email address, my webpage, the address for sending in questions or participate in my research, and hopefully we'll have an even bigger party next time. So thank you very much. Good night and stay safe. Don't go out.